before I experimented with psychedelics around the time I got into my master's at the age of like 25 or 26. I really would say that I was like I had adapted myself to be an ideal academic in a very formal professional sense. Like I would follow the lines. I would follow the lines of the pathway, of the structure, of the hierarchy, of the professors, of the conference ethics and norms. You know, I had adapted myself to that world, and I had, a temporal structure of myself in my head. Any deviation from that goal structure would provoke enormous emotional disturbances. And I think after psychedelics, I think that just got blown apart.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Psychedelic Conversations podcast. Today, I have with me Dr. Cadell Last, and he is an anthropologist, philosopher, and the founder of the Philosophy Portal. So today, we'll be talking about his progress and his experiences and all that he's creating in the space of philosophy, but also how his life has been informed by the psychedelic exploration. So welcome, Cadell. So good to have you back.
Yeah, excited to be here, Susan. Thanks for having me.
Great. So just in case our listeners don't know you, because we had lots of videos recorded in the past. We had so many conversations around so many things. But this one is going to be quite special and unique because also we want to talk about your new upcoming course and also some of your progress since the last 2 years in this past pandemic, era. And yeah, if you could just tell us about yourself so our listeners can have some context.
Sure. I think for the context of this conversation, I think the best way to describe me is I'm a philosopher who's basically been organized around two central questions since I became an academic around the time I was in my late teens. And those two questions are broadly stated something around the lines of how did we get here and where are we going? And those two, so about the past and the future of the human species. And those questions were really stimulated in some sense by a feeling of insane strangeness about the human creature, just feeling like we are an extremely strange entity, a feeling like there's nothing I was aware of in the rest of the universe that seemed as strange to me as the human being. And as a consequence of that, I had sort of just been driven to, try to get a deeper understanding of the human being in time or as time.
Thanks for sharing. And yeah, that's very insightful indeed. The big question of who we are, what we are, and everything that comes with it. So just quickly opening up this space for maybe talk about how psychedelics and psychedelic exploration informed your life and informed your work and your studies or your questioning, your seeking, in the way that they do. That would be amazing if you can just give us some of that insights.
Yeah, I mean, for me, psychedelics really came onto the scene around the time I would say, 27 or 28 years old. Not that I think I had like a little bit of experience tripping on mushrooms and stuff when I was in my young 20s, but it was sort of not from a place of like deep insight or deep curiosity about the nature of psychedelics or of consciousness and things like that. And I kind of like had always the sort of a negative perception, I suppose, picked up from high school, picked up from perhaps my early 20s, where I sort of connected psychedelics to, I wasn't able to differentiate, let's say, psychedelics from like other harder drugs and stuff like that I'd get. But in any case, around the time I was 27 or 28, I started falling down the rabbit hole of learning about not only psilocybin mushrooms, but ayahuasca and DMT, and sort of started to understand that these substances allowed access or were a portal into deeper areas of the mind that otherwise we had very limited access to or no access to. And the states of consciousness, which were described by the people. So I basically started doing research on them, and the states of consciousness that were described by very, advanced spiritual explorers and intellectuals appeared to me to open up deep metaphysical questions. And they, I guess, sent me on a journey of questioning many of my assumptions about evolution and about human consciousness, as I think many people have a similar experience. In any case, I sort of tried to educate myself about them as much as possible. I remember making a contact with a doctoral student in Toronto who had done his Ph.D. on the Santo Daime, which is a religious organization in the Netherlands that practiced with ayahuasca. And it just so happened that I was within a few months going to be going to Brussels to start my Ph.D. So I was very close to the Netherlands. And so when I made the contact with him, I sort of set the agenda that when I got to Europe, one of the first things I wanted to do was go and practice with the Santo Daime and explore ayahuasca. So long story short, I basically practiced with them at least 10 times. I've documented some of my experiences online. And since then, also explored psychedelics through psilocybin mushrooms, working for, say, a year and a half with a company, helping them with understanding philosophical foundations with psilocybin mushrooms. Also experimented a little bit with with peyote, 5-MeO-DMT once with you. And I'd say like my overall experience with immersing myself in sort of the psychedelic landscape has been, I don't know, in a very, maybe seems like a surface level or superficial distinction, but something along the lines of being far more connected to where I am in the present moment, much less concerned with visions of where I might be or what I might be doing or who I might be with or what my profession was, or, any sort of temporal scaffolding in my mind, which was telling me that where I was not the place to be.
Thank you. That's a really powerful thing to say, right?
Yeah, well, it is. Yeah. I
mean, most psychedelic explorers kind of say that, I think, from my observations. A lot of people say, it changed the trajectory of my path. It put me on a completely different path. Is it safe to say similar things about you and your work? But you did stay with your passion, which is philosophy and anthropology, all of the initial paths that you've been on.
It did change my conceptual orientation. I would say before I did psychedelics, I would describe myself, in terms of by conceptual orientation, I mean the ideological structure of my mind. So I would say before I did psychedelics, you could describe me, I probably would self-describe myself as a type of evolutionary materialist, very much in the grounds of, say, like, physics and evolutionary biology and, materialist anthropology, and mostly comfortable within a scientific frame of reference. Whereas after psychedelics, and this coincided with a number of different mind-opening experiences, not only psychedelics, but psychedelics played an outsized impact. Mm-hmm. But it opened up my mind a lot to dimensions of philosophy, which I otherwise would have been more closed, related to idealism, related to psychoanalysis. I've since specialized in those fields. Also became much more open to things like, initially things like romanticism and poetry, and just becoming more aware of sort of, I guess I became even more perplexed about what human beings were after psychedelics, and it just opened up different dimensions of philosophy. And it made me more open to exploring certain things, which I sort of would have a priori closed myself off from otherwise, I think.
Has it taken the edge off being fully immersed in academia and, embarking on this sort of academic studies? And
well, I think it complicated my relationship to academia, especially complicated my relationship to formal structures of learning, and it complicated my relationship to the whole process of professionalization in general. I mean, I think before I experimented with psychedelics, around the time I got into my master's at the age of like 25 or 26, I really would say that I was like I had adapted myself to be an ideal academic in a very formal professional sense. Like, you could, I would follow the lines. I would follow the lines of the pathway, of the structure, of the hierarchy of the professors, of the conference ethics and norms, of the journal recommendations and guidelines, everything. I mean, I felt like I was I had adapted myself to that world, and I had a temporal structure of myself in my head, which was dead set on becoming a tenured professor at an Ivy League university or something like that. Like that. That was like the aim. That was the goal structure, and any deviation from that goal structure would provoke enormous emotional disturbances. So if I got rejected from a certain doctoral program, which would have helped me on that path to becoming a tenured professor, becoming obsessed about becoming a tenured professor, even though realizing how impossible it was, even realizing how much of a pyramid scheme it was, that was my goal and the way I had adapted my professional identity. And I think after psychedelics, I think that just got blown apart. And I just stopped bothering, and I just stopped organizing my mind in that way. And I stopped, like if I went to an academic conference, I would be kind of like the weird guy on the outskirts of the thing, or I would stop caring about what academic journal would accept my papers or not. It was more about making my own space in the academic paper than conforming to the academic paper, or, just not. It definitely made my relationship to authority and to, just the whole doctoral process was probably more difficult. And I probably have made my life more difficult because of part of psychedelics. But it's also a pathway of liberation in some sense, because if you're on a pathway of liberation, your life is going to be more difficult because you're not walking a path of least resistance and least action. You're walking a pathway of extraordinarily high resistance, and you're doing things where you have to constantly fight against yourself and do things which will just again make your life kind of more difficult in some sense,
and more complicated, I
more
guess.
complicated, because you don't fit in a conventional way, and you're not willing to fit yourself in that way.
Could you speak to that a little bit more? What is it with the psychedelics that always distorting, dissolving, and distorting the structures, or the taking us out of the known and the default mode of behavior and all of that? What is it like? What did you come to? Is there any conclusion, or is there any exploration you have done so far?
It's like we can use sort of meta paradigmatics to get at this. By meta paradigmatics, I'm talking about sort of these big frames of reference that philosophy might use to describe epochs of humanity. So I'll use the frames of reference of modernism and postmodernism, just broadly described, to sort of maybe describe what's going on here. So modernism, broadly described, attempts to provide a single system or a single structure or a single framework that would organize the individual and society towards a better world. So for like concrete examples of modernist way of thinking would be if I'm a Christian, or if I'm a communist, or if I'm a liberal, or if I'm a, you fill in the signifier, it doesn't matter so much. The point is that you have one system or one structure which is organizing you and hypothetically the rest of society towards what you think will be a better world. That's sort of a modernist way of thinking. And in social science or in anthropology, there's a famous anthropologist called Claude Levi-Strauss, who was a pioneer of structural anthropology. So is studying things in terms of their structure. So there's a certain Christian structure, there's a certain communist structure, there's a certain liberal structure, there's a certain, and so forth. Postmodernism is basically trying to say that there is no one structure, that this is a too simplistic way of thinking, that there is no one structure, there is no one framework, there is no one way of organizing us, and there might not even be a better place that we're going to. Like that whole idea that you need a structure to go to a better place is itself what they call deconstructed. And a big thought movement related to postmodernism introduced by Jacques Derrida is the idea of post-structuralism, which is this idea that the subject never fits in a structure. So that the subject being my inner experience of Cadell and my ongoing life process, and Susan and her ongoing life process, that as subjects, we can try as we like to fit into this structure or that structure, but ultimately the subject is going to not fit, break out, not really be covered. Any structure which does purport to cover us will always have gaps, holes, contradictions, where it doesn't really make any sense, or where the subject, for example, there'll be some sort of self-relating contradiction in the structure, like someone who's a Christian but is secretly hiding a homosexual fetish or something like that. Like that, there's always some sort of weird perversion or contradiction internal to the structure, which the subject is using to mask some unstructurable or taboo or prohibitive dimension of its being. Now, the thing is that when you sort of go into a post-structuralist way of thinking, and you go into there's different ways we can take that, but the overall point being that what psychedelics seem to do is they make it very clear that whatever ideological structure is sort of you're operating on is you're almost forced into the illusory nature of it, or you're forced into some sort of, there's some gap which is introduced between you and the structure, where you can see it's not you, and you can sort of see that at one point you are identifying with it as you. You can also say this as it like relates to like marriage or something like that, or like the category of a parent, right? Like you can be too attached to the idea of being a husband, or you can be too attached to the idea of being a mother or a father. And psychedelics can blow these structures apart. And so you could say, well, what can you say about that? You can say subjectivity itself is something which is constantly flowing and evading any formal structuring principle of any kind. And at the same time, there is some need for some types of structures. It's just that the relationship the subject has to them is radically transformed, as far as my experience can tell.
Yeah, I really like that description. And also, I can kind of develop something like separation process, not the individuation that Carl Jung talks about, or any other psychologist or any other philosopher. So what I'm talking about is not even the Zen or the Buddhist approach to it. It's the separation process is kind of like rooted or grounded in somatic therapy, where you're having these experiences, but you're not the experience, kind of thing. So the separation would be the opening of a window or a space where you have a breather, where you have a space to breathe and think, no, I am experiencing this, but I am not this experience. So I feel like psychedelics have done that for many people, that separation process of being able to build enough capacity to sit back, or at least take a step back and observe and then recalibrate, or at least, question their motives and their paths that they're on. So it's a great description. So also, would you say that what's going on in the realm of the psychedelic space right now is that it's being promoted a lot for healing as a medicine, and trauma healing and all kinds of other healing and unconscious healing sort of approaches. Would you say that's kind of limiting what they are? Is a limitation to what they are actually, or could it be a way to work through from that modality as well?
I think we've talked on this a little bit before, but I've always sort of I don't know if this is an exhaustive or an extensive categorization, but I've always fallen under the idea that people approach psychedelics for healing and people approach psychedelics for exploration. So like, I think with the healing side of things, you might feel insecure in your own identity. You might be experiencing an over-attachment to a certain idea or an attachment to a certain structure, which is maybe producing some sort of neurotic fixation or some sort of neurotic emotional disturbance inside yourself, and you don't sort of have a deeper relationship to yourself. And in that sense, psychedelics might offer a connection, which you could describe as healing in some way. I think the way I approached psychedelics originally, with the story of me going to Netherlands and practicing with Santo Daime and doing a bunch of research and stuff, was always more in the mode of exploration, where I was sort of interested in sort of like the metaphysical questions that might emerge, new perspectives that I might have after experiencing psychedelics, even confrontation with more fundamental realities or something like that. Like so I think there's those two dimensions of it, and I think, and that might not be exhaustive, but like I think, and at least in the psychological literature, that those two dimensions of psychedelics would map quite nicely onto the idea that we have a sort of drive for security and we have a drive for adventure. And that those two drives are often paradoxical, meaning that they contradict each other. So like, of course, if you have a drive for safety and you have a drive for adventure, and adventure is seen as unsafe or destabilizing, or if you have a drive for adventure and you're in sort of a safe, sort of known enclosure, you've got to balance these two processes, I guess. And so maybe I would say that maybe some people fall more on one end of the spectrum than another end of the spectrum. Not one is more important or whatever than the other, but they seem to both operate.
And what about those who actually sit with the medicines or the psychedelic substances, but still not having the opportunity to have that deconstruction and distortion? We've seen these examples. We've seen so many people sitting 100 times with ayahuasca, because these are the conversations that I love having. So what do you think is happening with them? Like, what do you think? Because coming from the psychoanalytic background, what is your take on, like, why does it do it for some people and then it doesn't for many? If anything, it perpetuates more destructive behaviors. What do you think?
Yeah, the first would be sort of, again, so like if we take it back to modernism and we take it back to like, it's even like deeper than modernism, it's probably related to like the structure of the ego itself, is that the human mind wants to find one solution for everything. And that's the underlying problem for the ego. The ego is like a cyclops. And it just wants to find one quick fix. And this tendency of the mind to find one quick fix to solve the multiplicity of complex problems that exist in one's life is itself an underlying sort of. So if you're approaching anything in that way, like for example, if you're approaching the idea of finding a romantic partner in that way, like when I find this romantic partner, everything is going to be solved. Or when I get that new job, everything is going to be solved. Or when I finally get money, everything's going to be solved. None of those ways of thinking really solve the existential condition or the existential tension. You have to, in my view, you have to get to a psychological state where you are first accepting that to be alive involves a certain tension. To be alive involves a certain antagonism. There's a philosopher I study called Slavoj Žižek who says somewhere that there's a irreducible antagonism to the end or something like that. Like that the whole idea that you're going to get out of it is the problem. So let's start with that. Like that if you're treating psychedelics in that way, you're going to be disappointed. Because and also that whole underlying pattern reveals a death drive, which is that you actually, because being alive involves attention, and that's sort of like the fact of life, the desire that there's one thing that will end that is actually a death drive. You don't want to be alive. So that's like the deepest level. But on an analytic level, this whole problem reflects the history of psychoanalysis. So when psychoanalysis first started, it was actually by a medical doctor named Joseph Breuer. And he started analysis through hypnosis. And hypnosis opens up the unconscious in, you might say, a similar way that psychedelics open up the unconscious, meaning that it's an immediate gateway to like the foundational psyche or like the first principles of the psyche. Meaning that all of the layers of your ego's history and superego's history, all of the layers that have built up and accumulated from the time you were born until now, peel away. When you do the hypnosis or you do psychedelics, they have a similar effect. But just because in the moment they're peeled away, and so this was helpful for psychoanalysis originally because you could just get straight to the most infantile urges, like right away. But the problem, and now Freud's genius was that he saw that there was a flaw with this, meaning that he saw that, yes, it gave you immediate access to the most infantile impulses in the base level of the psyche. But once the hypnotic process was over, or in the psychedelic context, once the psychedelic effect wears off, your ego and the superego just return. So the point that Freud's emphasizing is that you have to, you can't escape language. In other words, you can't escape talking about your problems. You can't avoid it. There's nothing you can do. So if you're trying to do hypnosis to get around it, if you're trying to do psychedelics to get around it, even if you're trying to do somatic therapy to get around it, at least in the Freudian perspective, you have to talk about it. And there's no getting around talking about it. And the thing is that when it comes, and like in the first papers Freud was writing, he was talking about the magic of words. So like the magic of words being that, like, no matter how many times you've done ayahuasca, or no matter how many times you've, I don't know, done whatever spiritual practice it is that's trying to connect you deeper to your body, you know, there's something about words, there's something about language, especially with the other in intimate context, which is traumatizing. So that's what, in part, Freud, that's part of the magic of words. Other magic of words is like words are often also connected to the greatest feelings of euphoria. Like, so for example, if you really love someone and they tell you they love you for the first time, for example, like usually that's connected to a deep feeling of euphoria. But also if you know you're really in an intimate context with someone and someone says, you know, you're an idiot, or you're an asshole, or the thing is that the overall point is that psychedelics offer a release from your normative psychological reality. But that doesn't resolve the problems of your normative psychological reality. Like, so for example, the example I gave with psychedelics in my professional career was that it made my professional career more difficult. It made my relationship with my supervisor more difficult because it made me have more problems with authority. So if he was telling me my paper was shit, I would say, go fuck yourself. Right? So you see, there's no getting out of being alive, and that we have to use our words, and that we have to navigate a complex reality, which has no one final solution. So like on a base level, like you have to bring yourself up to that sort of psychological understanding that there's no way out of this thing, that no matter what happens in my life, there's always going to be something that's off, something that's wrong, something that's not quite going the way I'd like it to be. My desire is not going to be fully satisfied. And I have to deal with other people. And like this down deep thing is that like people don't realize how much they don't like other people. That's another thing that people aren't conscious of, how much why don't we like other people deep down? The reason we don't like other people deep down is because what is our starting condition? Our starting condition was a non-othered environment. We're in a womb. There are no other people there. Your first condition, you're with the mother or you're with the caregivers, and you don't need to use your words. You just have to cry, and then you get your needs immediately met. If you have a good caregiver. If you don't have a good caregiver, then you just cry and you become further traumatized. But in any case, that's hopefully a good answer.
Well, this is definitely helpful because coming back to the earlier question of like, why does it help some people and some people it doesn't?
Yeah.
This gives a broader context of what's going on really in the unconscious and our dispositions and what we carry inside and the memories and the sensations. But I like what you said about we cannot get away not using the words.
Yeah.
In any case, as a human being, I like that because somatic therapy also talks about, you can release trauma through non-language, non-linguistic modalities, right? But at some point, you do need to speak about it. At some point, you do need to explain what is happening in words. So, which is kind of really paradoxical and interesting.
Yeah, or like if you have a romantic partner, for example, like you can both do somatic therapy and you can both make a deeper connection with your body, and you can both become more comfortable with the organs of your body, sensations of your body, being more embodied. But you still have to speak to each other to organize the day-to-day minutiae of life, and you still have things that annoy you about each other, and things that exactly. So the talking can't ever be gotten rid of in that way.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I understand what you mean. You mean that we could do all the healing in the world, all the ayahuasca in the world.
Yeah,
it will work if we decide to sit on a mountaintop with nobody around.
Yeah.
But as soon as we go back into our ecosystem, and there are other bodies, our intimate families, partners, children, friends, social work, everybody, the other bodies. That is the trick. That's
the somatic therapy, is dealing with other bodies.
Exactly. So this is where it's at. And I think understanding in psychedelic exploration is very powerful. And that's why I do recommend group psychedelic explorations, just because you have other bodies to deal with while you are exploring your own interior world and your own inner landscape, your own consciousness and other dimensions. You are still among other bodies that's going to irritate you and point you towards some of the things that you need maybe attention or pay attention to.
Absolutely.
So would you say, in a nutshell then, would you say the real psychedelic integration work involves us working with and managing other bodies, really?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, the question of the methods and the practices that might be helpful for the integration process in psychedelics, I think is a really open question, because it's a really new thing in terms of integration into mainstream society. Like there's things like psychedelic psychotherapy, which tries to combine psychedelics with talk therapy, for example, and you can do group container processes as you do and have done. I think the real, I don't know what the real is something related to combine. If psychedelics are being introduced into the equation, then using psychedelics that are in some way helping bring your attention to the dimensions of that normative everyday world, which you need to pay closer attention to, or which you need to find new ways to approach it. And for me, those dimensions are always somehow related to sexuality, related to power, and related to money. In some constellation, there's probably other factors, but those, at least in my consciousness, seem to be the ones that where there's the most potential bypassing or the most potential avoidance strategies or resistance.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Do you know what? I would like to do another episode specifically on this, the last three topics that you mentioned, but I know we're coming to end of our conversation. So I just want to kind of wrap it up. But yeah, it would be nice to have you back to just specifically go into that area, what you just shared with us, the power, the sexuality, power, and the other one was
money.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in our current society, which seems to me to be madly, and I increasingly feel there's not really a way out of what I would call techno-capitalism. Yeah, I mean, it's just such a fundamental problem for people. So I think I would include that in with the power, which I think also emerges in different ways other than just money.
Yes, this is a very interesting topic indeed. So just before we move on, I'd like to track back to what you said about, in case the listeners are very new to this. I know that we will be sharing your YouTube channel and your website for the philosophy portal if they are interested in learning more. But some people might be new. So I just want to track back to the death drive, the concept of death drive. And also just want to highlight, which I found really important, that being human means that there is always going to be tension.
Yeah.
I like that a lot, because I think once we accept this and work with this, I think our lives would be so much more easier. And maybe we could then seek to sit in ayahuasca ceremonies less often.
Right. Yeah. I think.
would agree.
Yeah.
So the death drive, talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, the death drive was, I think most people accept, was formally discovered by Freud in and published about for the first time in a book called Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And I think the simplest way to describe the death drive is that, and the simplest way to contextualize it in the history of its discovery, is that for the first couple decades of psychoanalytic practice, the field was organized around attention to sexuality, or what might be called the life force. So the idea was that we have psychoneuroses largely as a result of unideal sexual organization or unideal sexual actualization. Towards the maturation of psychoanalysis, a few decades after that initial discovery, there was this basic idea that contradicted what Freud called the pleasure principle. So the idea was that the psyche was organized around pleasure. So if you watch children, it's as simple that you basically tend towards pleasure and you tend away from unpleasure or displeasure. The weird thing that Freud observed were adults that derived pleasure from unpleasure. Adults who derived pleasure from unenjoyable things. And he called, like, this gave a surplus pleasure. And this pointed the way to the idea of the death drive, which actually, that people are trying to undermine themselves. People are trying to undermine their own individual pleasures and their own independent individual drive, basically to unconsciously get rid of themselves. That they want to get rid of themselves. That they're repeating something in such a way as that they're doing themselves self-harm, or that they're and that they actually, again, don't want to really be alive. So that this is I mean, this to me, it helps describe many weird things that humans do, which animals would never do, and because of the psyche, because of our minds. It could be, like, for example, like when I was a primatologist, I would read Jane Goodall, and I remember Jane Goodall saying something along the lines of, she's never seen a chimpanzee commit suicide, right? Like animals don't seem to go to the same extremes of self-harm or self-negation that humans can do. Like, so for example, like if humans are, fasting to extreme dimensions, or if, like they're basically shutting down a basic pleasure circuit, or if humans are practicing abstinence to an extreme dimension, right? They're shutting down another pleasure circuit. And humans, and actually that these types of drives, which seem to decouple themselves from basic pleasure or simple pleasure, seem to constitute a lot of what people explore on the spiritual pathway. Things like fasting or things like abstinence are two basic examples connected to basic eating drive and basic sexual drive, which many people on the spiritual pathway try to work against. It's counterintuitive. Now, you might say that is a bringing to consciousness of the death drive and what might be called a trying to get rid of the ego. Right? Like that's a meta. So like, I want to interpret like that in psychoanalysis, we're talking about the psyche. So when we say death drive, it's not talking, it doesn't have to go to the extent where the psyche literally kills the body in an example of like you kill yourself. But what's going on is that you're trying to kill your ego. You're trying to kill a psychological structure. And so, I mean, I think that's why ultimately, to wrap this idea up a little bit, I think that my intuition is that there's a huge conversation to be had at the intersection of psychoanalysis and spiritual practices and deep spiritual metaphysics, like related to like Buddhism. Like, what's the relationship between the death drive and the nirvana principle in Buddhism? In the Beyond the Pleasure principle, Freud literally connects the death drive to the nirvana principle. So there's at least a big conversation here, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, it's simple enough, and it's a very powerful concept. And of course, we don't consciously sit there thinking we are sabotaging ourselves to take ourselves out, but it's just happening continually, unconsciously. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the spiritual path might be trying to make it more conscious, perhaps.
Yeah. It's very powerful concepts indeed. Thank you so much. Let's talk about your philosophy portal. What's happening in your world and what are you offering currently? I know there's an exciting course is coming up. So, and your intention, why you're offering this and what we are going to be learning, because I'm also excited to have a look into it as well. So,
all right. Yeah. So if anyone's interested, I'm going to be offering a course on Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra starting on July 15th of this year. You can go to philosophyportal.online to learn more about that, or you could also go to my YouTube channel where I've been hosting a series of dialogues on Nietzsche's philosophy. And I've also been offering sort of intro summaries to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. If you've never read the book before and you want a sort of, quick introduction to some of the main concepts, you can go to my YouTube channel, and you'll find everything you might need to start exploring that there. The reason I'm offering this course, and specifically focused on Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I can connect it to sort of what we've been discussing in this talk a little bit, which is one of the big meta-level oscillations throughout Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the story of a enlightened being who has sort of, let's say, won his enlightenment through deep and prolonged isolation, is trying to share his prophetic visions and wisdoms with the rest of humanity. And throughout the book, he oscillates between going off onto his own in the middle of nowhere, and then back into the human world with a new strategy of how to communicate his deepest messages to the rest of humanity. And so he'll oscillate back and forth like this between deep isolation and immersing himself in the human world. And you get this idea that what he's trying to work for is a type of spiritual method for people to connect to their deepest self and at the same time immerse themselves in the human world, with the major theme being the problem of human imperfection. And that's why he sort of starts the book with the idea that God is dead. God is dead means that any idea of a perfect being is dead. And that we have to sort of learn how to overcome the human condition in this world with these bodies, with what nature has given us. So I think in that sense that Nietzsche's philosophy is passionately and intensely in tune with many of the things that people in the West on spiritual struggles are wrestling with, many questions about ethics, many questions about the overall meaning or journey of the human being and the human condition. These are things that Nietzsche's wrestling with deeply, and he's ultimately trying to become a leader, that not the leader, but a leader in the spiritual struggle for overcoming the self. And that's I think so. I think there's just there's in it, like, it's such a dense book. Every passage, every sentence, there's just things that you can pick up there and go for like a long walk, and you just be racking your brains for days. It's one of the most powerful books of the 20th century. If I can give it any more sort of a build up or a sort of an enthusiastic endorsement, it would be something along the lines of, it's perhaps one of the most influential books politically, theologically, artistically, poetically of the entire 20th century.
Wow. That is something very powerful. That is something. Well,
check it out. philosophyportal.online.
Definitely hyped me up for sure. And I'm sure our listeners are really intrigued. Cadell, thank you so much for all the wisdom that you dumped on us. I think there's so much to kind of...
It's a lot to chew on there.
Lot to chew on, and lot to probably to re-listen, to really make it ours, make it to understand the way that we grasp these concepts, and then make it our own wisdom. I think these are very powerful. I think philosophy goes hand in hand with what we are doing in terms of trying to understand psychedelic substances. I feel like it's just that, we need all the help, all the support, and all the modalities we can to bring in to the table so that we can grasp and understand, or at least, have a deeper connection and make more sense of what psychedelic substances are helping us do. I think there's a saying, just want to quickly squeeze in. They say that psychedelic exploration can make you intelligent. Would you agree? Like, a lot of people turn to philosophy, a lot of people turn to poetry and art and creativity. So there's always that element that really is very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has the capacity to expand what you think the psyche is. I don't know if it inherently makes you more intelligent, but it certainly expands your awareness of what you might be. But it's ultimately it's not a deterministic thing. Like, but I don't think it's a deterministic thing. But it certainly blows you open to dimension and in it actually like the deterministic aspect of psychedelics is if you take a high dose of a psychedelic substance, your mind will be hugely impacted. I don't think you can get around that happening. But I still think it has to be coupled with other things, and again, like the real wisdom comes from connecting it to day-to-day life, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And that sums up everything we're trying to bring here into the conversation. Ultimately, everything ties into how do we navigate in our day-to-day life, which is my ultimate passion, and how do we deal with other bodies in our lives, and how do we make it as comfortable as possible for ourselves living in this dimension as human beings. So thank you so much, and we will have you back very soon, and all the best with your courses, and we'll sure to share all the links. And if you guys want to check out his YouTube channel, if you're drawn to philosophy or any similar subjects that we touched on, this is just kind of scratching the surface, not even that. So there's a whole lot to discover on Cadell's YouTube channel, which is Cadell Last.
Yeah, just search my name.
And we'll have all the links below in the comments. So thank you so much for joining us. Hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. Do get in touch, type a comment, and tell us your thoughts and your feedback. We appreciate you, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Thank you for now, and see you. Thanks, Cadell.
Peace out.
Thank you so much for joining us. Psychedelic Conversations podcast is designed to educate, inform, and expand awareness. For more information, please head over to psychedelicconversations.com. You can also share with your friends or leave a review so that we can reach more people. You can also join us in our private Facebook group to keep the conversation going. This show is for information purposes only, and it is not intended to provide mental health or medical advice. Thanks for listening.